when I talked to Dr. B about this, I would pick Dr. B's brain, and he would basically say, like, look, you can look at the years that we would have guys taking drugs and then years that they weren't on drugs. And you could see big spikes and then you could come down. Big spikes, come down. Other countries, they were consistently doing drugs. East Germany doing drugs consistently year over year over year. The Soviets, at least according to this, were not. We're going to go over why the Soviet system was so effective, and we're going to start right now. Okay, so when we're looking at the Soviet system, why was the Soviet system so effective is a big question. But the other big question is, who really was the godfather of the Soviet system? A lot of people will say Matveyev, Medvedev, and they don't realize that there was a 2-time Olympic champion, a 1-time Olympic bronze medalist, and I want to say 5 or 6-time world champ who was legitimately the baseline of all things Soviet training. And this dude who wrote this book put together absolutely everything into this entire Soviet book that outlined basically everything that you could come up with in training. And this document here was put together late 60s, early 70s. Okay. And I was trained by Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, who was a throws coach from the Soviet Union. He was Olympic champion in 1972. He was a Olympic bronze medalist in 1976. He also coached Yuri Sadiq, who's a world record holder in the hammer throw. And now also has continuously just been working with basically, I want to say it's something like 6 or 7 Olympic champs, and then on top of that, like 18 medalists, 19 medalists, including the recent hammer Olympic champion, Ethan Katzberg. So one of the things here is that I had emailed Dr. B about this individual, and he was basically like, yeah, he's basically the head of the Soviet system, and started everything back in the 50s and 60s, and even worked with cosmonauts in the 60s. And I want to point out right off the bat that between 1950 and 1961, this dude had set over 18 world records, or 16 world records. And so I think the biggest factor when we're looking at something like the Soviet system, okay, I think there's a couple big factors we have to bring up. First, it's the mystique. Okay, there was the Eastern Bloc, the Soviets, and then there was the Western Bloc. So we have to think through, we couldn't penetrate the Soviet system per se, at least not until later on. We didn't really know what they were doing. So the West didn't really know what the East was doing. The Soviet system, the Soviets had an idea of what the American bodybuilders were doing because the culture was so prominent. And I even remember talking with Dr. B that they knew that these bodybuilders that were training in California and were prepping for these competitions, they knew that they were eating something. They knew that they were on something. And that's who they looked towards to try and get access to things like DECA, D-ball. The Soviet words, if I remember, were metandolone, I think, or meton was what they would call D-ball. Okay. Now, going back to this, I think the biggest factor is the mystique of not having access to something. So from the outside, you're like, what do they have, right? What are they doing? And the interesting part here is that it also goes back to, we want to know what are they doing so we can make sure we're doing it better than they are, right? So it's us versus them, and we're sort of pitting one another against it. And then, even to the point where the Soviet system of research, they have their system, we have ours of peer-reviewed journals, so there's another difference there. But what's interesting here is actually Dr. B studied pedagogical studies, okay, which is essentially like how to teach people properly, or effectively, I should say. And the person who wrote this book on the Soviet weightlifting system also studied that. So not only were they studying athletics and athletic development and the research behind it, but they were also studying how to implement it effectively. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later, where they really actually prioritize culture in the sense of like training culture. So I think that's an important aspect. Now, the other big thing here is that the Soviet system had a lot of success, and a lot of people are going to say, well, they were all on drugs. Yes, it's likely they were on drugs. And when I talked to Dr. B about this, I would pick Dr. B's brain, And he would basically say, like, look, you can look at the years that we would have guys taking drugs and then years that they weren't on drugs. And you could see big spikes and then you could come down. Big spikes come down. Other countries, they were consistently doing drugs. East Germany doing drugs consistently year over year over year. The Soviets, at least according to this, were not. What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. Where else I want to go with this is that it's the mystique, it's us versus them, it's what are they doing, but then on top of that, they had success, okay? Aside from having success, is they were working as a unified front. Dr. B used to say that the interesting thing in the U.S. is that everybody sort of like would hide what they're doing in training. Okay, I actually don't think that's necessarily that. I don't think that sentiment is 100% accurate anymore because of social media. But what ends up happening is that in the Soviet system, so the throwing world in the Soviet system would send all their data to Dr. B. Dr. B would compile all the data and all the information. He would put everything together as basically like big, huge reports. Then they would have these conferences. They would issue these reports and say, like, this is the best way to coach athletes at different levels. Then the athletes would get to a specific level. Once they got good enough, they would go to the national center. So everybody was sort of working together, whereas in the Western system, it wasn't necessarily done that way. Information sharing maybe wasn't as much of a priority, probably because there wasn't as much money in it, right? So I think that's another thing. Now, this also means that the Soviets were looking to advance all sports. They were looking, Dr. B had spent time with Karelin. Dr. B had spent time with their super heavyweights and with Riegert and working through, like, just as almost like an assistant, helping them improve their training system. So all sports in the Soviet system had some impact on one another, meaning, like, hey, we're going to do snatches to increase this athlete's explosiveness. We're not going to do quarter squat, banded, tantrum, hamstring curls to increase it, because everybody was looking for actual real fundamental lifts to improve things. And so that's what they were focused on. And so that created this system that became like the Soviet system, but we've never really pinned down what that means. And so a lot of people have put out videos, they've made content around it, but they have no idea where it's really rooted in. And everything is literally rooted in this book initially. Okay, this was released late 60s, early 70s. This author has a lot of work that came out mid 60s. Okay, he goes through, he even cites someone like Zatsiorsky, who became prominent in the West, who actually taught at Penn State, actually lived in Pennsylvania for quite a while, for a long time. And this dude was hanging out with these guys, developing the entire system. And I think that's ultimately what I've learned, is that the Soviets were very good at putting everything together and like compartmentalizing or chunking different portions of the sports. And then they would chunk these sports and then create this overarching system that was dynamic. And I think one of the downfalls in the West is that we haven't clearly done this. Our NGBs have not even clearly done this. And it's led to where we are today, where we're in 2025 and we're still analyzing a document from the late 60s, early 70s and looking at it thinking, why hasn't our NGB done this? They've done a better job of talking about nutrition and technique and actual periodization back in the 1960s and 70s than we have now, when we've had a multiple time Olympic gold medals working for us. So if we're looking at different aspects of training, the big thing that I'm looking at is, what's the technique they're talking about? Okay. What are the exercises that they're looking at? What's the exercise selection that they're looking at? Are there specific things around size, stamina? Are there specific things around coaching culture? And then how does all this stuff get lumped together. Okay, so I want to start off with, and I have so many freaking notes here. I actually want to start off right away with technique. Okay, so we're going to go through different aspects of technique, and then we're going to get into the exercise selection. Then we're going to get into order of exercises. Then we're going to go through size and stamina, and then coaching culture, and then even looking at things like loss of consciousness. And actually, before we even start this, one thing I even want to point out is that in the back of this document, okay, you can see classification standards applied in the Soviet Union, okay? And then they have body weight categories, and this is specific to weightlifting. They have body weight categories, and then they have weights lifted. Okay, so let's look at snatch and jerk, right? So if you have a 110 kilo lifter and they could snatch 167.5 kilos, and they could clean and jerk 220, and they would total 387.5, they were considered the master of international sport. Okay, master of sport, international class. These were world-class competitors. And even just looking at these numbers, okay, and then looking at master of sport, 110, 145, snatch, 192.5, clean and jerk. Now we're seeing, these were like national masters of sport. And what's interesting that I wanted to share is that inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength, this is how we've set everything up. This is how we're thinking through long-term planning, long-term development. We're looking to help athletes become the best versions of themselves. We're looking for athletes that want to challenge themselves long-term through these different levels and to achieve greatness by chipping away over a long period of time. And so we've taken a lot of this thought and a lot of these ideas directly out of this book, and we've used this throughout our entire system. You guys can check it out. You can head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. You can download Peak Strength. You can test this in any specific sport, and you can start to apply this to try and become the absolute best version of yourself so you can envision yourself standing on top of the podium. Because honestly, the main goal of all this is that we're trying to create something that gets you to be that best version of yourself, to achieve things that you otherwise wouldn't be capable of achieving. Okay. And one cool factor here that I really want to share is that being trained by Dr. B was that he would consistently say, hey, a lot of systems work. A lot of systems can develop athletes. But what it comes back to is developing that culture, developing the individual, and getting the most out of your athletes and getting the most out of your training system. And I think that that's sort of rung true with me. And the one big factor that where I was fortunate is that before I got into the weightlifting realm, I had read this book, and I had basically gone through this multiple times to try and analyze, study, think through what training meant to me. And in so doing, my classical skill or my classical learning and my technical learning is from this book. I didn't grow up in the weightlifting world. I didn't grow up, I did snatches and cleans in high school, but I didn't grow up actually being taught by an American classic weightlifting coach. And so some of the stuff that we're going to cover in technique is what we've taught for years because of this book. And I think that that's pretty cool because I wasn't really like tainted by other systems. It was more so like, this is what they said worked. I tried to apply that in coaching, and then what worked and didn't work is what I just either whittled away with or tried to improve upon. So the first place that I want to start here is technique. Okay. So we're going to let's look at page 67. Okay. So if we're looking at page 67, some of the basic understanding of force and movement, they're going through applying force, but when they get into some of the actual understanding of everything, it's really, really cool how simple they break down the actual technique. And even to the point where I actually want to start with on page 77, they show a diagram, okay, and they break down the diagram into these basically 18 different levels, and you're essentially looking at like When's the moment that the bar comes off the floor? When's the moment that the knees are fully extended? And so like right off the bat, you're reading this and you're going, okay, bar comes off the floor, knees get extended. Well, what does that mean? Okay, so you push your knees back, because if my knees are staying forward, my knees aren't really fully extending. And if you watch someone like Yuri Vardanian lift, you're seeing, okay, knees clear back, so you have more vertical shins. Okay, makes sense. Next point. Maximum bending of knee joints in their push under the bar. Okay, this is a big one because this is technique, and I just want to start right here. Okay, this is page 77, and now we're talking about weightlifting specific techniques. So we're talking about snatch, we're talking about clean. Okay, and this goes back to, I released a book back in 2018, I want to say 2019, and by this time Haley Reichert had made a couple teams, and Jordan Wissinger made the senior world team in 2018. And so Jordan makes this team, we release a book, and we start talking about technique. And we had defined below the knee, so the shins, the knees push back off the floor. And I would call this point from below the knee to above the knee the no man's land. That's when lifts would be lost. And the reason why lifts would be lost is because if the knee movement wasn't good, if the knees stayed forward or anything like that, that would be positive, or that would be bad. Okay. So long story is that at the top of no man's land is an area that I would refer to as the reciprocation point. And I remember, I want to say this was like an old weightlifting house podcast that Max Ada was like, and Max, I'm gonna attack you here. Max was like trolling me, like Dane comes up with these terms and stuff like reciprocation point. What does that even mean? And I had remembered like watching Quo. Okay, so Quo was coached by someone who had a Soviet background. And I'm going through and I was like, well, this is what Quo does with her knees. They come back, they come under the bar. And I remembered in this book that I have highlighted the third aspect. So it goes moment of tearing the bar off the platform. The second is the moment of knee extension. Okay. The third is maximum bending of knee joints in their push under the bar. Maximum bending of knee joint in their push under the bar. Maximum bending of knee joints in their push under the bar. My interpretation was they reciprocate under the bar. Maximum bending of knee joints in their push. So we are actively pushing the knees under the bar, okay, to a maximum bending point. And this will help keep the barbell closer to the center of mass. And so we called this the reciprocation point. And the big factor that we learned from this was that we wanted to stay flat-footed as long as possible while the knees pushed under the bar. I called it the reciprocation point, and then we would get maximum extension of the ankle, knee, and hip joints together, maximum height reached by the bar, fixation of the bar in the drop, what's happening with the elbow joint, the hip joint, the knee joint, the ankle joint, vertical reaction of the feet, height attained by the bar, speed of movement of the bar. So we were going through all these different things in coaching, but my main focus was all lift off, knees back, knees under, what happens at contact. Those were it. And so I was getting trolled for having this reciprocation point, and I'm reading this book from the Godfather of the Soviet System, at least according to people that were actually in the Soviet system, that actually had a clue, that actually worked with Soviets, that were Soviets, and they're like, no, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to push your knees under the bar. But everybody here was saying, no, don't do this. So long story short, we go long development through variations, using this book as our guide, using my experience from other sports. And then, fast forward to 2022, Haley medals at the senior world championships. And now we've got one of the best teams in the country in weightlifting. So it was interesting to go through this. So that's like one of the simple aspects, is that you're looking at these different points of simplicity. Okay. So now we're going to go and we're going to look at, let's look at page 23. So right into the beginning of the book, they really start to dial in the type of grips, the type of squats, the different types of things. Now, sporting results, weightlifter depends on physical, technical, psychological, lifting of the greatest weight, smallest amount of expenditure. the components of the starting position, lift to full extension, the drop, and then the clean and jerk, also the preparatory for the dip and the jerk. So we're looking through all these different notes, and then all of a sudden you start to see flow charts. Okay, so there's a very clear flow chart about how you go start, and then what happens during the start, and whether or not you should use a dynamic start or not, which I'm going to get into. Okay, then you keep going through these, and you go, there's different phases and elements of this. And then we just continue to roll. Okay, so now we're looking at different aspects, and we're going, okay, starting position. They lay out the starting position. They lay out a really unique way to establish the grip. They lay out going through lifting to full extension, okay? And even here they're talking about pushing the knees under the bar, which apparently is the worst thing ever, according to Americans, is to push your knees under the bar. So I want to go back here because they have all these pictograms and all these flow charts, and then we get to page 69, and we're going through, and we're going, okay, lift to the knees, the lift above the knees, and they're clarifying what happens. And we have to remember, if these books were accessible and you go through and you're like, wow, they're really clarifying each of these things. One of the unique methods around creating a buy-in and creating trust is actually having these things done. So to me, the reason why the Soviet system was so unique is because they actually laid this stuff out very thoroughly, even to the point of the second phase of the pull, the full extension, just like the first, must also begin with a massive effort, 160 to 180% of the weight of the bar. And this is going to happen over 0.14 to 0.025 seconds in the first half of the path of the full extension. So they talk about how quickly this occurs, okay? And then active influence on the bar ends when the angle of the knee joints is 165 to 170 degrees. So think about when you're lifting and finishing that full extension. So the interesting part there is that I know, based off of talking with Christoph Kipp, like these numbers aren't far off. I've even seen numbers in like the split jerk, stuff like that. Someone like Haley has put on like, I want to say it was 2.5 times the weight on the bar was the force going into the bar because of the amount of speed that you need to put into it. And so they're using these numbers, and they were starting to break things down and recognizing like, okay, this stuff does pay off, okay, with technique. And then they start to look in, and they're going, okay, page 77. Now we're looking at vertical pressure is characterized by significant growth of pressure on the entire foot. A maintenance of this force to the period of pushing of the knees under the bar when this force is somewhat reduced. Okay, so now we start to really look at this even further. In the full extension, it's sharply increased, and then it drops and falls away as you go to catch the bar. So these are some really, really interesting points around force application. And then we want to get into, I want to go into even the part here because they start to have these graphs and these bar path pictograms, okay? I want to show on page 132, they even have like a, dude, this is the crazy part here, is they start to have things like what happens when you don't have a full extension? Well, the lifter doesn't place the knees under the bar. This is on page 112. On page 112, okay, so we're looking at, now we're at, let's say we were at page 77, 112. By this time, this is like the third or fourth time this has been mentioned, right? So then and still, remember, this is the death of, that's terrible to do all this. But they're looking at, in this case, movement with the bar to the side, crossing the feet during these positions, correct positioning of the legs, and maintenance of balance. It's interesting because they have basically like an error of the lift, and then they have a cause of the error, and then they have the correction that will help it. And those simple things, along with the flow charts, but then also with the in-depth analysis, is like, that's why people like the Soviet system. They took everything that you could possibly come up with in the sport of weightlifting and laid it out in here and said, look, this is what you have to do. Okay, so now we're looking at, I wanted to even just get into, because they start to talk about exercises here. But the one thing here is that even on page 132, they have a very clear way of how to teach the progressions of the lifts. Very clear. Under our guidance, V.A. Druzhinin carried out experimental work in which it was convincingly showed that coaching is more effective if the exercise is learned in reverse order. V.A. Druzhinin, this is, remember, late 60s, early 70s. Learn how to do this stuff in reverse order. From the drop, full extension, lift to the knees, starting position. That's what we're looking at. This method turned out to be 40% more effective than learning in the normal order of elements. Okay, so even your work and learning should be done backwards. Okay, so now we're looking at this and we're going, wow, this is pretty interesting. Like these guys did a pretty good job of breaking these things down. Wouldn't it be neat if USA Weightlifting did something like that? So then we're going through and we're going, okay, coaching these things. Again, learn in reversed order. Okay, learn the drop. After the drop, dropping down exercise or adopted squat with a stick, then bar, and finally lightly loaded bar held on vertical arms, and learn backwards. Learn in reverse order. Okay, now I want to go to one more or two more things on technique before we get into the exercise aspect. Okay, so now we're looking at, all right, page 164. Okay. Page 164, we start to diagnose things like, should you have a dynamic start? Okay, so dynamic start here. It is well known in physiology that an increase of work produced by muscles is observed when some of them are tensed by resistance, so a pretension. So Franz Bosch comes out of the book in 2010, 2012, 2022, pretension, slack. Everybody's like, oh my God, these guys were talking about in 1971. Dynamic start. What happens when bend the legs a few times, after which the lifting of the weight is begun? Okay, so that's going to help with pretension. And then finally, we even get into breathing, learning how to breathe properly, learning how to breathe prior to executing the lift. Okay, making sure that you bring in, and then you start the actual movement pattern. And then finally, I want to go to page 252 here. We start to see things come together. They start talking about actually developing youth lifters. And then on page 252, this is where I want to bring up some of the aspects around this, is that periodically, for the perfection of the technique to snatch and jerk, the formation of willpower is needed for the lifter. Youths love to overcome difficulties. Therefore, training must not be too simple. Willpower is developed in connection with the overcoming of difficulties of a task. And I want to say that this is like the most important aspect. So page 252, we're talking about willpower, okay? And the Soviet system talks about motivating athletes, and that young athletes are motivated to overcome difficult tasks. And so by perfecting technique and lifting at near limit weights, okay, you're looking at technical aspects and you're looking at physical aspects. So these are like mental and technical tasks that are challenging to the individual. And if you're trying to develop willpower and emotional intuition, we have to constantly put pressure to move as effectively as possible and to push as effectively as possible. And if we're not doing these things side by side with the adoption of exercises with weights, methods from other types of sports enable an all-round preparation, this leads to the development of willpower in the young lifter. Okay, so now they're literally talking about, and this is from a guy who studied pedagogical resources, okay, was a 2-time Olympic champion, 1-time Olympic bronze medalist, 5-time world champion. And he's saying, look, if you want to develop a lifter, you got to teach them technique and you got to get them to have some freaking weight on the bar. And if you push these kids to learn technique, you will develop the culture. And today we are still struggling with these things in the United States, we're still struggling with these things like, well, we shouldn't teach these kids how to do these lifts because I'm not good enough as a coach to teach them. I'm the one who's struggling here, but then the kids don't want to show up to work. Well, the kids don't want to come show up to work because you don't want to teach them the things that are hard. And when they learn the things that are hard, guess what? They get better and they have more willpower and they continue to develop. Now, okay, order of exercises, 199. Okay, I want to go here because this is where it gets really, really interesting and pretty freaking cool because this is where you have to really look at like the nitty gritty stuff here. Numerous investigations have shown that a better effect in training is obtained if it begins with exercises of speedy character, then come exercises in strength, and lastly in stamina. And again, this is page 199, okay? One of the biggest factors that I took to heart from Dr. B was you have your competitive exercise goes first, then your hard complex movements are second, then your heavyweight third, and then some type of movement that might resemble your competitive movement, or if you're doing some hypertrophy work. If you guys are inside of peak strength, you're going to see that's how everything's set up. You do a fast movement, then a heavy lift, and then you do accessory stuff. And you got to do that over and over again. That's how we develop champions. That's how you become the best version of yourself. That's how you stand on top of the podium by doing things this way. This is 1971, and they're saying, look, this is the order of exercises. That's it. That's the way it goes. Okay? You've got to do fast movements first. Most frequently, you should begin with a fast movement, a power snatch, a speed movement, then any classical lift in which the lifter performs significant training weight, and lastly, back squats and pulls. The consecutiveness of performing the exercises in weightlifting training is dictated by a definite order, adopted in competitions in weightlifting. Okay, in 36% of cases, the strongest lifters began with exercises of speed strength characteristics like power snatch. In 28% classical press, that was back in the day. Okay. Only 1% with classical clean and jerk. I actually asked Piros Dimas about this once. I said, when do you actually start a workout with a clean and jerk? And he was like, only if you're very bad. So in 60% of cases, all sessions begin with the snatching exercise. So this means that most other cases, it's some type of leg lift. In 60% of cases, sessions close with back squats. So if you're starting with a snatch, ending with a back squat, you're in pretty good, company. Now, I'm going to link this to page 200 because on page 199 and then into page 200, now they're talking about order of exercise and stamina. And this is one thing I remember also just getting tons of flack for, is that this is back, we were talking and I said, sometimes we snatch, or sometimes we'll do snatches and then we'll actually do back squats and then we clean and jerk. And I had said, we'll do back squats and then clean and jerk on tired legs because oftentimes lifters in a meet will have, when they're snatching, they're super amped up and then they have this emotional dump after the snatch. So that they sort of drop down after snatches and then they've got to come back on the clean and jerks. And it can be a challenge because you're like trying to get that intensity back up. And so a lot of people, why would you do that? Why would you squat before clean and jerks? And I want to share this is that Haley Reichert, when she took her second attempt at World Championships, when she won the world bronze medal in the clean and jerk, she waited 9 or 11 minutes from the second lift to the third lift, 11 minutes, and she didn't take a single lift. She didn't take a lift. She sat there and just waited and waited and waited and went out, hit her third clean and jerk, and won the world bronze medal. It is necessary periodically to include competition exercises, snatch and clean and jerk, at the end of a session to train on them against a background of tiredness. A lifter will draw on their stamina. It's well known, with a large number of competitors, a competition can drag on for 3 to 5 hours. The most successful in these will be lifters who display great strength and stamina. For the selection of exercises in their order of a session, it's necessary also to note that the adaptation is in regard to loading. Okay, so basically, in my mind at the time, I interpreted it that way, and that's what we did, and I thought it was very successful. And especially if you had someone who consistently would say, my legs feel tired at the end of clean and jerks. You can resolve that by squatting before clean and jerks. I'm not saying you do that all the time. I'm saying you should try to do that, maybe once a program or once a week for 8 weeks leading into a big competition. Then you stop doing that 2 weeks out, and you're going to find some good success. Now I want to go back to order of exercises. Okay. So they're even talking about the number of reps in a set. So the number of repetitions in a set has a vital importance for the effectiveness of training. 10 to 40 lifts of a weight in a set is talked about. Systematic weightlifting literature, in a set, 1 to 3 reps is quite rare, more so up to 5 times. There's no definitive explanation. And then they start to break down distribution of load by number of repetitions. And this is on page 195. And this is a chart that is basically made famous in Zatsiorsky's book, where they break down, 19% of the time they do singles on snatch, 59% of it was doubles, 20% of the time it was triples, 4 or 5 sets, 5 reps was like 2% of the time. Clean and jerk, 57% was doubles, 18% was triples, 3% was fours. This chart, page 195, okay, breaks down the distribution of load by numbers, okay? So you're starting to look at it and you go, okay, most of the time you're doing doubles and triples, some singles. It's like, wow, so we're still talking about this stuff. And I think a lot of it goes back to the lack of knowledge on the Soviet system. When you're breaking these things down, you watch somebody who is maybe in the weightlifting space think that they have any idea. You watch the kettlebell dude talk about the Soviet system, which is Pavel, and he's talking mainly about some sport systems, but not even, he's not even really breaking down like Verkhoshansky's sport system. And like Verkhoshansky's cited in this book, he has his sport system to a point, but a lot of it is rooted from this book because they had such carryover. And he really wasn't even that much of a sport coach. This guy was, but he did do a lot of solid research. Now, okay, let's go back to page 192. Even here, we can see examining the effect. And so a lot of people will say, Dane, where do you get these numbers? And not all of my charts are exactly off of this, but they have 720 lifts throughout a time frame. Examining the effect of 80 and 70% programs on the growth of results in every separate case, we found that the optimum quantity of lifts for the greatest training of lifters, second and third rank and novices. So they're looking at, like, if you're a master sport international versus a master of sport national versus like class 1 or 2 or 3, they're looking at their programs and they're saying 80% weight, you should do 15 lifts. 70% weight or more, 15 to 20 lifts on the snatch. On the clean and jerk, 15 lifts at 80% weight or more. So like 5 triples, do it over 80%. You're going to be better than everybody else. Back squat, 80% or more, 15 sets or 15 reps. And so you can start to look at that. And then you're looking at, well, what about maximum weight? What about when it's really heavy? Now we're starting to look at strength, and we talked about stamina. And now we're starting to look at this going, okay, when you lift really heavy, the average weight lifted in training is made up of lifting different weights, small and large, but trainers and lifters today, calculate the size of the load and lifting maximum weights. Makes up 30% of the total load. A significant volume of work with large weights is explained comparatively simply. Pulls, squats, various assistance exercises, okay? So they breaking that down. I want to go and look at real quick page 194 here. They'll start to talk about plyometrics. But now I want to actually go back into exercises. So we go back and we go, well, what are good exercises that we can build off of? So on page 120, we start to see assistance exercises for snatch, power snatch from a hang, power snatch off blocks, snatch pull with full extension, snatch pull without full extension, wide grip clean, one-handed snatch, close grip snatch, snatch balance with bar on chest, snatch balance with bar on the shoulders, upright clean, power clean, clean from the hang. So now you're looking at clean pulls, jerk behind the neck, jerk with a wide grip, half jerks, one-handed jerks. And then you're even looking at specialist assistance exercises for general benefit. Good mornings, back squats, front squats. Split lunge with bar on the chest. Now, this is an interesting one. If you watch the Polish team from the early 70s, they would do split lunges with the bar on the chest. If you watch Ronnie Coleman do bodybuilding stuff, he's doing walking lunges with the bar on his chest. If you watch really good football players get really good at cutting, they do front rack lunges. Okay, these are all movements that help with your abs and with your leg strength. Push press, narrow grip press, bench press, seated press, French presses. So now he talks about developing trophism. Okay, developing trophism, development of flexibility, development of speed, and even talking about doing high jumps, doing dumbbell work, okay, leading to greater strength. And then when you have greater trophism, you can now display more power output. Okay, so these are some real key concepts. And then when we start to look at, let's see if I go back. Now let's go and look at page 167. Okay, so now, actually, I'm just going through here. Okay, here's another one. The central nervous system is relieved of conscious coordination of movement. Okay, this is one that I think needs to be highlighted big time. Okay. In the control of locomotion seen from the side of the brain, it's got the character of functional change of interaction of muscles, but unsatisfactory control of the activity of individual muscles. So everything's working together. The central nervous system is relieved of conscious coordination during locomotion. Lifters striving for the automatic performance of a lift can concentrate their attention on the creation of the maximum strength and speed of muscular contraction in a distinct phase of the motive act. This is the biggest thing that coaches that don't like weightlifting movements like snatches and cleans are missing out on. One, they're missing out on teaching athletes how to move very effectively. So when you teach an athlete technique, the athlete has to practice it over and over again so that it becomes this conscious coordination of movement. When Saquon Barkley cleaned 405, he wasn't thinking pull to the knee, now push the knees under, now make contact, now wrap my elbows, now catch it, stand it up. He was doing an unconscious coordination. Okay, when the central nervous system is relieved of conscious coordination, we get more athletic, we get more coordinated. Okay, it takes time to develop that. And I call this technical aggression. You get to the point where you can motivate yourself and you're dialed in, you're focused, you're doing something. You're very dialed in with aggression and technique. And then guess what? You learn this in the weight room. And as a coach, you get feedback on how this athlete reacts to what you're saying. And you get stronger, you get more mobile, you get more athletic. And then guess what? You can apply it over into the field. You use logic and technique to execute high-speed movements instead of getting mad. Okay, so now you have better change of direction and all these things. And then the crazy part here that we're going to get back into, automatic movement is connected with the codification of experience and long-term memory. Thus, the stability and inertness of the motive act is formed. So the big thing here, automatic movement. We want to create automatic movement. That's the main goal. Weightlifting, sports performance, automatic movement. So we want to be able to apply force in very specific manners that's automatic, removing the conscious brain. Okay, then we're going to fire faster. That's what these lifts do. That's what the Soviet system was teaching. And then they go, coaching is a pedagogical process as the result. And this is I've covered this earlier, but this is a different section here. Coaching is a pedagogical process. It's the result to which the student gains knowledge, skill, and ability. With coaching, by weightlifting exercises and by methods of training, a student develops motive qualities, the liking for hard work, stubbornness, and willpower. People who don't want to do weightlifting movements, they don't develop willpower. They don't develop hard work. They don't develop stubbornness because they're too busy doing functional exercises that are too easy to learn. And then the athlete doesn't develop the technical aggression, and they don't learn the ability to have automatic movement. That's the biggest thing here. And then if this is the first book personally that I really read outside of learning from Dr. B, outside of learning from Poliquin and his group, this was the first book that I sat here and I was like, I'm going to train athletes this way. This is telling me that this is how you develop culture. You teach them hard things. You make them do these hard things. You clarify what those hard things are. I want an athlete who's going to be stubborn and has crazy willpower, because guess what? They're going to be really freaking good. They're going to be really good on the field and in training. And that's going to lead to substantial growth as an athlete. The initial coaching of a weightlifting exercise and the method of training is a highly crucial process. You guys do your trap bar deadlifts. We'll do cleans. Okay, go ahead. See what happens. Just look at the banners in the gym. This is why it is very important in the period of initial coaching to gain a more rational technique in relation to the functional features of the lifter. So I think that's a huge thing, is that part of the Soviet system was teaching the culture behind motivation and willpower and stubbornness, as they term it, and the likingness for it. You like to do that. And that's the big thing, is that if you want to be a champion and if you want to be really good and you want to push yourself to be the best version of yourself, you've got to like the work. You've got to like the journey. AJ Brown just had a quote where he's like, it was fun to be a champion for 2 days, but now I just like to be the best. I just want to be the best. And it's the journey to being the best, and proving that is as fun, if not more fun, than the destination. And that's the biggest aspect that I got from here. It was when I was going through my notes and looking at everything. Now, I want to get off of that a little bit, because we're on this for quite a while now. So, and it's pretty cool too, because then they come back and they go, the trainer must be flexible in coaching in relation to the assimilation by the student, adopting various methods, parts, and as a whole combined. Then they go back into coaching in reverse order. They go into examples of coaching in reverse order, what that looks like, and they lay everything out. They lay out what you should be paying attention to and all those things. And then they start to talk about size. I want to go into size quickly here on page 170. And then I actually want to get into the exercises on gym equipment. They have got everything. Okay, now page 170. And they even talk about what is considered lower volume, higher volume. Okay, so page 170. Now we're going to get into... and the training load is a definite stimulus for the organism. Okay, here we go. Now, influence of nutrition on muscular strength and trophism. Now we're looking at, it's considered that for hypertrophy of muscles, two conditions are needed: a sufficient surplus of protein and a corresponding training stimulus. Chris Beardsley wrote, I think it's called Functional Hypertrophy. Basically, his whole thesis is that mechanical tension, get within 5 reps of reserve, 5 reps of failure, and then eat protein, and you're going to get bigger. Okay. So here's the cool part. Doses of protein of more than one gram per kilo. So if I weigh 100 kilos, I better get more than a gram per kilo. Okay. So that's only 100 grams of protein. That's not a lot. That's not a lot at all. Less than that, the body weight reduces and there's no increase in strength. Okay. Increases of strength of muscles, it's necessary to have a larger quantity of protein. The minimum is 1 gram per kilo. What's interesting, okay, is that then they go into, you need 800 calorie surplus if you want to gain weight. And they go into even things like gelatins and stuff like that. There's a video of Akayev and Klokov back in the day, like dishing up meat soups. And I remember Dr. B being like meat stews were huge for what they were. Obviously, they were. Akayev was also taking good guess, but also doing those things. So, looking at different aspects here, I want to get into 272. I also have written down here, energy expenditure of weightlifting. I have a little tidbit here on the order of the loss of consciousness, which I really found interesting. Then clean and press, snatch, clean and jerk. Lifter of high quality, we're looking at caloric energy expenditure. 272. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, the inclusion of gelatin. Liver has exceptional nutritional value. Carbohydrate needs to be represented quite broadly. Use vegetables, fruits, berries, flour, grains, potatoes. And they go into specifics here, like very clear specifics. Now, let's get into one final thing, because I thought this was an interesting one that we could go into, even something as precise and as nitty gritty, before I show you the actual book and what it is. And truly, I was coached by a Soviet Olympic champion. I've been in the Soviet system. A lot of what I do is impacted by Dr. B, from Charles Poliquin. I've been around Zygmunt Smalzerts, who's a Polish Olympic champion. And this book is arguably, I would say, has the biggest impact on my coaching career, like bar none. Technique, ideology, the development of culture. I think everything comes back to, and even using, like they mentioned plyometrics in the book. They talk about Verkhoshansky and the exercise selection, but then even getting down into the nitty gritty things, like in order to avoid loss of consciousness at the moment of lifting maximum weight, the following demands should be fulfilled. Before lifting the bar, don't breathe quickly. So don't hyperventilate before lifting the bar. Exhale slightly, then inhale at the level of 3/4 maximum, begin the exercise. So then you go, raise high and expand wide the chest. Create a rigid platform for the bar to sit on your shoulders, okay? Pronounce emotional excitement, which gives rise to an increase in the demand for oxygen. Don't do that. That's going to lead potentially to more of a blackout. While pressing the bar or doing a squat over, don't cover the bar with your chin. And then don't squeeze here from the clavicular joint, okay? Don't squeeze. Let it almost be relaxed. Let the bar sit here and then go, okay? And so they have 6 bullets on how to avoid blacking out, because this is a real issue. Okay, so the big factor is that we can go back to the beginning here and think through, what is it about the Soviet system that was so interesting? 1, it was us versus them. 2, we didn't have access to it. 3, it was the success. 4, they had this culture of everybody was together sharing this knowledge, right? Then on top of that, we're learning all of these nitty gritty things that they shared and they planned for. Everything was well planned. They even have warm up plans in here. They've got the actual aspects of going about when you're injured, things like this. And honestly, it's really impressive. It's a book that I aspire to write myself at some point. And really, this comes down to it is the greatest, in my opinion. This is the greatest representation of the Soviet system. At least I think this is like the beginnings of everything. I think a lot of this is rooted here, and then Verkhoshansky developed off of this, Matveyev off of here, Zatsiorsky off of this. I think Dr. B off of this as well, with the work that he did with the throws. And this is truly, Dave Riegert trained in this system. And this is from Arkady Vorobyev. This is a textbook on weightlifting. This is, in my opinion, the best weightlifting book in the history of the world. I don't think there's been a better weightlifting textbook. I don't think there's been a better weightlifting book. R.A. Roman worked with Vorobyev. And I think that they all pulled from and tried to improve the system, but they were not as clear. Still great writers and great coaches, obviously, but they never achieved what Vorobyev achieved himself, first of all, but also I even wanted to bring up a little shout out here to Tommy Kono. Inside the book, they're talking about, I think Miyake was one of the guys who did the frog dance from the Japanese, if I remember correctly. And he actually starts to talk about like the best technicians, and he's naming a couple, and then names Tommy Kono. And I remember Norik Vardanian telling me his dad loved Tommy Kono's technique. And I think that that's something that if we could look back at Tommy Kono's movement pattern and recognize that this is the Soviets were realizing, like, this guy over here was doing something. He was doing something really good. He was a total animal. He's the greatest American weightlifter by far. at least based off of titles. And it's like, we can still learn from these guys. There's some outdated stuff in here, but we can compile all these aspects, put it together, and apply it in a consistent system and not get distracted by some of the fancy stuff that might not be paying off. So the textbook on weightlifting, it's the greatest book ever written on weightlifting from Arkady Vorobyev. You've likely never heard of Arkady Vorobyev. He is the godfather of the Soviet weightlifting system. To me, he's the godfather of Soviet sports. He's created all these things. And anyone who's, I don't believe Pavel actually understand. Like, I've never heard him mention Vorobyev. I've never heard anybody else mention Vorobyev. Vorobyev is the dog. And I was fortunate enough to be sort of brought into recognition of him through Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, and hopefully this has brought you into Vorobyev's work. So if you guys need help with your training, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Get into Peak Strength. Start thinking about learning those movements that are going to help you become a better version of yourself. It's going to lead to greater willpower, greater stubbornness. That's what they say in here. And if you want another video similar to this one, click right here, because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.